Well, social engineering uses practices such as attacking people's self-esteem, using schooling to create consumers and wage workers. Social engineering also works in other ways through things like zoning regulations, corporate persuasion techniques, through things like debt peonage and inducements to transition from growing food crops to growing cash crops, and other things to, and I want to focus here in part two here, to deliberately undermine people's ability to provide for themselves from the land. So in other words, social engineering is and has been used to disconnect people from a self-sufficient lifestyle on the land. So let's take a look at that here in part two. According to one of these social engineers, economic development can be induced or even imposed. He talks about in 1967. Economic development can be induced or even imposed, and that comes from page 145 of John Bodley, 6th edition, Victims of Progress. The idea being, as John Bodley writes, that this isn't what he's not saying this, he's critiquing this paradigm. He says one of the most significant obstacles blocking native economic so-called progress was the fact that their cultures were self-sufficient. So when we take a look at self-sufficient people of the land, and in this case we're looking at the colonization of indigenous peoples, that is one of the key themes. Along with self-esteem, the settler society and the colonial powers that be go after undermining a people's self-sufficiency, go after a people's ability to provide for themselves from the land by coming up with various ways that will force them to participate in the cash economy. As we go through some of these ways, I think you will find a parallel to the non-native experience as well, one that might be a little astounding, and suddenly you might, I'm hoping, you'll take a step back and kind of look, well, where are we at today and how did we get there? And why am I going to college to get trained to be an employee? You know, because that's a new thing too. People used to go to college because they wanted to learn, to gain knowledge. Now people go to college. Colleges look at them, at their students as customers and as potential employees. So very different. That's been a paradigm shift. So as we go through this, I think you might see some parallels to life in general in an industrial society. Wage work. So when the colonial societies went into indigenous lands, indigenous areas, and saw these people being self-sufficient on the land, they said, well, no. We want to open mines, we want to log forests, we want to drain swamps, we want to build roads, and we need people to do that. And we also, in order to do all that, we need to take control of the people who are living on this land right at this moment, you know, as we're trying to come in and colonize this area. So in the last, since, like I said, since the Industrial Revolution, and particularly since the 1800s, and particularly since World War II, these pressures to force indigenous peoples into wage work have increased because the land is desired by the settler society and the colonial powers that be, and the need for laborers is such that in order to have an industrial economy, you need to have laborers. In order to get laborers, you have to force people to no longer be self-sufficient on the land. It comes down to just simply that. If you have an industrial economy, you need wage workers, and in order to have wage workers, you have to make sure people are not able to provide for themselves from the land, because if they're providing for themselves from the land, one, they're attached to the land that you want to mine and log and drain and build roads over, and two, they don't need your money. So why would they sacrifice themselves, give up their free time, give up their family time, give up who they are in order to become an employee, a laborer, when they are perfectly happy and self-sufficient, living on their own in a self-sufficient lifestyle, being their own boss, as you could say, being able to provide for themselves from this land that they're connected to. So the problem was, how do you get these landed, self-sufficient people into wage work? Well, settler societies came up with these ideas, trying to figure out ways to force people to need cash, because self-sufficient people don't want to have to go out and work for other people. They are happy being independent, making their own decisions about what they do with every hour of their daily life, right? So they aren't going to become wage workers unless they have a need for cash. So these settler societies set up conditions wherein a self-sufficient people need cash. Maybe it's they are no longer able to provide as much food for themselves as they were able to. Maybe you require certain housing codes and building codes that they can no longer live in the homes that they were able to build for themselves and now have to buy more expensive homes. Maybe you impose certain taxes that are required to be paid. Maybe you make sure that they go in debt. Anything that can be used to create an artificial need for cash will create a pool of laborers or wage workers. So how do you create people a need for food? Well, that's what the United States government did when it tried to exterminate the buffalo, right? It was trying to undermine the Plains Nation's basic food that it relied on. That was the buffalo. It was a way to get them to be controlled. Now, at that time, of course, the United States wasn't looking to make them into wage workers so much as just to gain control of them, but the principle is the same, that you undermine a people's access to their food supply. In various ways. Maybe you just outright claim the land, just like they did in England with the Enclosure Acts, where people who were living on the land suddenly found they were no longer able to access the commons. And so therefore they were no longer able to make a living from the land, and they were suddenly found that they had to go into the cities to find work at the factories that were suddenly springing up with the Industrial Revolution, and those factories were desperately in need of wage workers. So people were forced off the land through things like the Enclosure Acts, right? So this way you're denying access to those people, denying access to food for those people. Housing, yes, there was an example, like I said, establishing building codes, saying this is what a house has to look like. This has become even worse in recent decades. Like my mom, she grew up in a home where her dad built them a one-room home with a loft, right? And there was 4 kids, 2 adults, but they all lived in that one room with a loft as he and his brothers worked on building another room and another room over the next few years. They were very, very poor. But that was the only way that they were able to maintain a lifestyle on the land. And he was a independent stonemason and bricklayer. So they were able to build their own house bit by bit. Nowadays, building codes and zoning rules can make that very difficult, if not impossible to do in many parts of the United States. Housing, the other thing I wanted to say with this is I went to a conference, it was quite some years ago now, maybe 10, 15 years ago, for a organization known as Great Lakes United up in the Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. And while there was a woman who was speaking from Toronto, and she was talking about how they were trying to keep their population within the city limits and prevent people from living out in rural areas. And she said one of the ways they were doing that was by making the requirement for septic tanks artificially expensive, so that most people could not afford to go move out to the country because they would need to buy an unnecessarily expensive septic system. And the whole idea of making it unnecessarily expensive was to keep less people from moving to the country and keeping more people in cities. And in effect, what the effect that has is that only the wealthy can then move to the countryside, while the poor people are left in the city, right? So that's another way that people are manipulated and have these forces that array against them to prevent them from coming into a deeper connection with the land. Taxes. You will find within crazy Africa, the colonization of Africa offers a very interesting example of these taxes that I think we see echoes of course, in our contemporary United States. But the colonial societies, the colonial governments in these different countries in Africa they were colonizing would impose things like dog taxes or head taxes, how many people live in your household you have to pay a tax on, taxes for, anything that you could really think of. But the odd thing was many of these taxes were only applicable to Indigenous people and nobody else had to pay them. And the idea was, the intent behind these taxes was to create an artificial need for cash so that these self-sufficient Indigenous peoples would then go out and find wage work, right? And of course, debt's getting somebody into debt. We'll talk about that in a minute. Yeah, okay, let's move on. So with this idea of taxes, this is primarily where this came from. People would impose the colonial society would impose this artificial taxes. You've got a dog, you got to pay a tax. You got 3 people in your home, you got to pay a tax. You got, I don't know, it could be ridiculous things. You just bought a iron pot, you have to pay tax on that, but only if you're an Indigenous person. So this would create people an artificial need for cash. And so people would go out, they'd find a job, they'd make the money they need to pay off the tax, and then they would quit and go back to their self-sufficient lifestyle. This was not acceptable to the colonial governments of South Africa. Nairobi here is one example. So they passed these laws that said, for Indigenous peoples, you cannot quit your job unless your employer gives you the permission to quit your job. If your employer does not give you permission, you cannot leave your job. You must stay at your job. And if you left your job anyway, without your employer's permission, your employer could file this complaint of desertion of a registered native. And it was a crime, like I said, for the workers to quit. So if they did quit without this authorization, they were punished. There was corporal punishment. And some of the Native people who were punished for leaving their job without their employer's permission died from this, right? So this was how, I want to say, desperate settler society or the colonial powers that be, how desperate they were to force self-sufficient people of the land into becoming wage workers in their nation's economy, particularly their nation's industrial economy. Another major way that self-sufficient people of the land are forced into the wage economy is through not so much becoming wage workers, but through becoming cash croppers, right? That you suddenly are no longer growing food. If you're a farmer, you're no longer growing food to sustain your family and community. You get hooked into a system where you are growing food to sell, to make cash, to pay taxes, or to meet the minimum housing requirements, or as we were talking about with Toronto, the artificially high septic tank requirements, or as we'll talk about later, to pay off debts that you got into. And in fact, cash cropping is famous for luring farmers in with free seeds, free fertilizers, free all kinds of stuff so that they become cash croppers and dependent on becoming cash croppers. And then they have to start taking loans out to get expensive equipment or to buy, seeds, or to buy these fertilizers the seeds are dependent on. And so they end up going in debt. So then that means they have to grow more cash crops instead of crops for their family and their community. And it's like a snowball effect, right? It keeps getting bigger and bigger, and you get further and further away from being self-sufficient on the land and growing crops just to feed your family and your community. And you might end up with cash cropping, no longer being able to afford to grow crops for your family and community, but instead have to only grow crops to make cash. So the problem from the social engineer's perspective that self-sufficient people do not grow crops, self-sufficient people who do not grow crops for cash don't contribute to economic growth. So self-sufficient people do not grow crops that contribute to economic growth. Self-sufficient people do not grow crops that contribute to economic growth. Instead, they grow crops to feed their family and their community. And that, according to the social engineers, was a big no-no. That means you're not being a productive participant of the industrial economy. So the solution was to create artificial conditions wherein a self-sufficient person, people, society spend more time growing cash crops rather than food crops. Because if they are growing more cash crops rather than food crops, then they are no longer able to be self-sufficient. So therefore they are having to keep on being cash croppers, and therefore they have been roped into the whole global, national and or global economy. And in these days, it's all about the global economy. So you as a small farmer are competing in this huge marketplace, and it's a very difficult place as a small little fish in which to swim. And so if you are no longer self-sufficient on the land as a farmer providing for your family and your community, you're in a really tough spot. If you got roped into this cash cropping business, which almost all farmers have around the world, particularly in the United States. And it's happening very fast in places like India. It happened in places like Canada. Mexico is trying to hold out. Many of the small farmers down there are struggling to fight off the United States GMO crops, for example, in order to keep their small farmers self-sufficient. So this is still quite the struggle on the global scale. Debt peonage is such a big one. So in the fur trade, when the fur trade companies came over to Turtle Island, or what we know of as North America, like the Hudson's Bay Company, for example, they would use a system of debt peonage to get their trappers, largely in the beginning, these were native trappers, to get their trappers dependent on the fur trading company. So what would happen is people might come in with a few furs. Maybe they wanted a rifle, maybe they wanted a pot, something that a trader had been to visit them and given them some free gifts that they said, this is pretty cool. And the trader said, if you want more, bring in a few pelts to the trading post and next year and we'll do a deal. And so they go in, heard you got some more guns. We'd like to buy some, and the fur post would overcharge for the item they were purchasing and underpay for the furs that they brought in. And in this way, most trappers found that they always came up a little bit short when it came to the company, that the stuff they were buying always cost a little bit more than the furs that they were bringing in to sell. And so in this way, the company would say, well, that's all right. Just bring furs back next time, next year, next time you're in, or next year, come back with more furs, and we'll make sure that gets paid off. But then again, of course, they'd go in, and if they weren't really paying attention, weren't aware of what was happening, they'd end up buying more stuff, end up in more debt, and it would go on and on like this. And this is something that happened in other realms too, we'll talk about in a second. Just want to also mention that Hudson's Bay Company, when it came over to North America here, it took a huge section of what's really essentially central Canada, from Hudson's Bay down to the Great Lakes, and claimed it as its own without talking to the native people, of course. It's called Rupert's Land, or they called it Rupert's Land. Hudson's Bay Company called it Rupert's Land. The British Crown, that is the British government, gave it to Hudson's Bay Company in 1670, I want to say. And Hudson's Bay Company went on from there to prohibit anybody who lived in this vast region from trading with any other fur company except the Hudson's Bay Company. And so there were mixed bloods, for example, who were savvy to both cultures, the native cultures that their moms usually came from, and the non-native cultures that their fathers came from. And they were starting to trade with people like the Americans, who offered them better deals for their furs. And Hudson Bay Company would come after these Métis or mixed blood free traders, as they called them. So the little people were the free traders. They were the ones saying, we have a right to trade with anybody we want to. And the corporate traders were saying, no, you don't. You can only trade with us because you live in our corporate territory. And the mixed blood people were like, well, it is not your corporate territory. You never talked to the native or mixed blood people who live here to see if that was okay with us, that you set up shop here and forbid us to, you start to control what our actions are. So anyway, a whole big story behind all of that. So the problem that debt peonage is going to solve is that while self-sufficient people can be made momentarily dependent on the cash economy through small debts, taxes, fees, once those are paid, they can return to self-sufficiency, right? So Africa tried to take care of that. Different colonial governments in Africa tried to take care of this so-called problem by passing laws that forbid you from quitting without your employer's permission, quitting your job without your employer's permission. Here is another answer from the social engineers for how to ensure that people are going to become more ensnared in becoming dependent on a moneyed economy, is to put them into debt peonage. So the solution is to ensure perpetual need for money and perpetual dependency on the cash economy through debt. Whether you're working as a trapper, you're working as a cash crop farmer, or you're working as a laborer or an employee. And this debt peonage system has only increased, has only gotten worse in the present day. Johnny Cash talks about how this debt peonage system in his song, I Owe My Soul to the Company Store, how this debt peonage system was used with everybody, particularly mining companies, lumber companies. They would pay their workers, and then the workers would often go spend that money at the company store. And again, they would underpay, overcharge, and the workers, underpay them for their work, overcharge them for the products they were buying. And so the employees always ended up in debt to the company, and thus having to stay with the company even when they wanted to leave because they owed the company so much money. Today, of course, nobody can get a house. Well, very few wealthy people can get a house without going into debt, right? So you either have to go into debt with huge mortgages, or you have to go pay rent, and rents are incredibly expensive. But either way, you are in debt to the system to have just a roof over your head. Something in a system built on democratic techniques you could have built before. You could have done on your own and built before, right? So this is all part of Wendigo economics, making sure people are trapped in a system of debt dependency because of the debt they hold, that they then must always be giving up their life to an economic system, either as cash croppers or wage workers of some kind. So this is a very serious problem. And for people who are students, this is something you may not be realizing yet in college, but you might start feeling that mounting pressure of debt you're gathering, because nobody or very few people sit down and say, when you graduate from college with this debt that you're accumulating, you are going to have very little freedom of choice as to what you do next. You will need to become a part of that moneyed economy. So the student debt is very interesting. As federal grants have shrunk and tuition has dramatically increased, people are going more and more into debt, so that most college students are graduating owing what, $20, $30, $40, $50,000, some even more, $100,000. And those have to be paid off, and those debts are going to force people into making economic choices that they might not otherwise have made had they had the freedom to be free of debt in this way. So again, this is when we take a look at colonial policies, we start to see patterns that are echoed in the colonial settler society itself, in the industrial economy, in the industrial economy of the modern day. So all of this we've been talking about in terms of getting people into a moneyed economy, undermining self-sufficiency deliberately, the social engineers deliberately undermining self-sufficiency to create people who are dependent on a moneyed economy through debt or through, through debt peonage, through cash cropping needs, through all these taxations, what have you. Once you enter that cycle through some sort of inducement, whether that's taxes or debt, or cash cropping, once you enter this cycle through an inducement, you got to pay your taxes. So I got to go work for wages, and whoops, now I can't quit because the government made it illegal for me to quit without my employer's permission. Once you enter that cycle, you enter into this idea that you need the cash for a food, outside goods, or taxes, or to pay off your debts, or to buy synthetic cash farming chemicals because you've been roped into cash cropping, and maybe you got pulled into that whole so-called green revolution. We're growing these seeds that are owned by these multinational companies, are reliant on that multinational company's synthetic fertilizer or synthetic pesticides, and suddenly you're having to buy all these things you used to be able to take care of before. Now you have to buy seeds each year. Now you have to buy synthetic pesticides, synthetic fertilizers, and even as a farmer, you are suddenly finding you lost your self-sufficiency. So you need that cash. You go get wage work or start growing cash crops to get the cash that you need. And in putting the time into wage work or cash cropping, you have less time for self-sufficiency or food crops, which means you have less self-sufficiency, which means you need more cash, which means you need more wage work or to grow more cash crops, which means you have even less time for self-sufficiency or to grow food crops, which means you have even less self-sufficiency, which means you need even more cash, which means more wage work, so on and so on. You see how this works? Once you get in this cash trap, it is very difficult to extricate yourself from. And this is all part of the social engineer's plan. I talk in another lecture on the North Woods, Anishinaabe King, and mining, how the social engineers from urban universities took a look at northern Wisconsin and Michigan's Upper Peninsula and said, these people are too self-sufficient. We have to figure out ways to make them become productive members of the nation's industrial economy. And you can find that in P.S. Lovejoy. You can find that in George Werwin if you do your research into those books. I also have written an essay on it too. Maybe I'll try to put a link up to it somewhere. It's called Listening to the Trees. Okay, that should pretty much wrap it up for part 2 of All the World's a Stage, taking a look at these global policies and practices that are geared towards undermining the self-sufficiency of people who live on the land. And in particular, our focus has been on Indigenous peoples, but you see the very strong echoes that go all throughout every person's experience who has been, whose family has been, or whose heritage it once was to be self-sufficient on the land. And again, this is just an overview. We're barely a little skipping stone, skipping across the water here. And there is so much more to look into, and I encourage you to delve further into. It's not always easy to find. You really have to dig for this. Look into things like the Enclosure Acts, and look into things like the debt peonage system of the fur trade. Look into the Green Revolution. Look into what's happening with India and farming right now. So many different things. All right, I'm going to end it here, and we will move on to look at global institutions and the policies that they are creating that are impacting people all the way down to the tribal level, the municipal level, the state level, wherever, all of us, as we think globally, act locally, we have to also, many of us have to be acting on that global stage too.